The desert tasted like iron and old fire. Kale Morrow had learned to hate the taste years ago, back when the Vethka first came and burned the sky into something that never quite healed. He walked anyway. That was the thing about humans. They kept walking even when they should stop. His wagon was gone. He'd woken 3 hours ago to the sound of the drifter's engines cycling up in the pre-dawn dark, and by the time he'd cleared the slip from his eyes, there was nothing left but 2 ruts into the ochre dust and the distant shriek of repulsor fans fading west. The drifter had been with him for 11 months. He'd fed it from his own water ration. He'd replaced its bearing mounts twice with parts stripped from a Vethka wreck. He'd even, in a moment of weakness he would take to his grave, given it a name. He didn't think about the name now. He thought about the road ahead, and the city that shimmered in the heat haze like a mirage that had gotten tired of pretending. Korath below, the humans called it the pit. The Vethka who'd built it called it something in their own language that translated roughly as, the place where things come to be valued. Kale figured that was honest enough. He came to the gate at midday, sweat-caked and carrying nothing but the battered canteen on his hip, the curved knife in his boot, and the small silver whistle his daughter had hung around his neck the last time he'd seen her. He blew the whistle out of habit when he reached the gate. Same as always, 3 short notes. The guards on the wall were human. They looked at him with the particular blankness of people who have learned not to invest too much in strangers. Hands, said the one on the left. Kale spread them. Weapons? Leave it, he considered. Then he bent and drew it from his boot and laid it in the lockbox at the base of the gate post, same as everyone else. You didn't argue at the gate of Korath below. The Overseer's rules were the only rules in 1,000 kilometers of dead earth, and arguing with the rules meant arguing with the Vethka garrison that enforced them. And arguing with the Vethka garrison meant a fast death or a slower one, and Kale Morrow had not survived 9 years in the waste to die at a gate. The city folded around him like an old wound. It had been a mining complex once before the burning, deep shaft extraction rigs, processing facilities, worker housing. The Vethka had gutted the upper levels and rebuilt them as a trading hub, a place where the scattered human settlements that survived their occupation could bring salvage, food, labor, information. In exchange, they received Vethka-manufactured goods. Water processors, protein packs, the cheap pharmaceuticals that kept the chronic ailments of post-burning life from becoming epidemics. It was, Kale understood, a very elegant trap. You couldn't survive without the goods. You couldn't get the goods without bringing something the Vethka wanted. Over years and years, the whole calculus of survival had tilted until there was no longer any serious conversation about resistance. There was only the next trade, and the one after that. He found the drifter in the 3rd row of the impound yard, stripped of its load, sitting between a rustic crawler and a pre-burning pickup truck that someone had mounted a howitzer on. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went to find a drink. The tavern was built into what had once been a coolant reservoir. Low ceilings, curved walls of aged alloy, the kind of place that hummed with the memory of industrial function. Kale found a seat at the bar between a woman with a mechanical arm and a man who was either asleep or dead. He ordered water and reconstituted grain spirits and drank both in the wrong order. That was when Executor Vane found him. The Vethka moved differently than humans. They were tall, bilaterally asymmetric in the way of creatures that had evolved on a world with inconsistent gravity. One shoulder always slightly higher. The head carried at a tilt that humans read as arrogance, but was simply anatomy. Vane was a high-caste executor, which meant her coloration was the deep, iridescent blue-gray of deep ocean water, and her secondary eyelids were fully developed. She wore the thin silver-white robes of her station. 3 human guards flanked her at a distance that said they were protection, not servants. She sat across from Kale, without being invited. You crossed the breach alone, she said. Her vocal translator rendered her language into flat, accented standard. That's not done anymore. No, he agreed. What were you carrying? Medical supplies. For the Reach settlements, were. A long pause, the secondary eyelids swept briefly across her eyes, the Vethka equivalent of a slow blink. Your vehicle was apprehended carrying contraband relay components. Communications equipment that operates outside Korath protocols. That's interesting, Kale said. Since I loaded the wagon myself and didn't put any relay components in it. You are Kale Morrow. Not a question, he looked at her. Former military technician, former resistance cell coordinator. You were in the Kaleth uprising 9 years ago. Another not a question. You were pardoned under the reassimilation accords because the accords required it. The Vethka conclave is not always as patient as its agreements require it to be. She let that settle. I have an offer for you. He didn't say anything. There is a man in this city called the Mech. He controls the city's primary power generation, the deep core thermal tap that runs everything from the processing floors to the medical units. Without the thermal tap, Korath below becomes uninhabitable within 48 hours. The Mech knows this. He has made himself effectively ungovernable as a result. Her secondary eyelids cycled again. He has also been running unauthorized salvage operations in restricted sectors, which represent a direct challenge to Vethka territorial authority. I want him removed, not killed. He is too valuable. His knowledge of the thermal systems too specific. I want him brought before the conclave for reassignment. And the relay components will be forgotten. Kale turned his cup in his hands. The grain spirits tasted like cleaning solvent and nostalgia. You want me to take on a man who controls the only power source in a 1,000-kilometer radius, he said. Using what exactly? Your particular talents, she rose. You have until third bell tomorrow. If you have not initiated contact with the Mech by then, the relay components become evidence, and you become a cautionary example. She paused. I believe the current method of cautionary example involves the proving floor. She left. Kale sat with his drink. The woman with the mechanical arm 2 stools down said, without turning, You should run. Tried that, Kale said. My legs got old. The proving floor was what the Vethka called the theater of discipline, and the humans called the pit in the pit. A circular depression cut into the bedrock of the lowest level, open to the levels above via a grated ceiling, so that the whole population of Korath below could look down and watch. The Vethka had not invented gladiatorial combat. They had, however, perfected the logistics of using it as both punishment and entertainment, which Kale suspected was a distinction without a meaningful difference. The Mech's operation was in sublevel 4, past the thermal venting shafts, and through a section of corridor that smelled of sulfur and machine oil. Kale found it because he asked the right people in the right order, which was a skill he all developed over years of surviving, in places where the wrong people would have you stripped for salvage before you finished the sentence. The Mech turned out to be 2 people. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was that one of them was barely a meter tall. Bren, said the small one, not looking up from the circuit board she was soldering. She was maybe 60, with the compact density of someone who'd spent decades in tight spaces, and had the spine curvature to prove it. And before you say it, yes, I know what you're here for. Vane sent the last one 11 days ago, and the one before that. What happened to them? Colm happened to them, she said, and nodded toward the second person. Colm was large. That was the only word that covered it adequately. He was seed, which made the scaling difficult. But Kale estimated that standing he would be 2.5 meters of scar tissue and reinforced exoskeletal plating, the military-grade augmentation that had been common in the early resistance years, when the Vethka were still underestimating what humans would put in their own bodies to fight them. His face was obscured by a full-coverage visor, the kind that regulated light sensitivity. He sat very still. He doesn't talk much, Bren said, but he hears everything. I'm not here to fight him, Kale said. Bren finally looked up. She had the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime making fast decisions about whether a thing was worth salvaging. Everyone says that, she said. Right up until they try. Vane planted the relay components, Kale said. I'm not her man. A long silence. Somewhere in the thermal vents, something cycled and shuddered. Vane doesn't need to plant evidence, Bren said slowly. She has enough real evidence on half the city to execute the other half. Then why bother with me specifically? Bren set down her soldering iron. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone rearranging their assumptions. Former resistance, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been doing her own reading. Caliph, he said. Long time ago, something shifted in the room. Colm turned his head very slightly. We heard about Caliph, Bren said quietly. Most of it's probably wrong. Probably. She picked the iron back up. Vane wants you to bring us in because she knows if she sends her own garrison people down here, Colm tears them apart, and then she has a garrison problem on top of a Mech problem. You're a buffer, a human face on a Vethka agenda. She glanced at him sideways. Is that about right? About right. And you came here because... Kale thought about the wagon. About 11 months of careful work, and the name he would take to his grave. He thought about the whistle around his neck and the daughter who had given it to him, and who was somewhere in the Reach settlements, waiting on medical supplies that were currently sitting in an impound yard. Because I need my wagon back, he said. And because I think you're going to do something stupid with the thermal tap, and I'd like to suggest a less stupid thing instead. Bren stared at him. Then she laughed. A short, real sound, nothing performed about it. Calm, she said. Get the man a chair. They talked for 2 hours. Bren had been running the thermal tap for 6 years, ever since the previous operator had died of a respiratory condition that Kale suspected was not natural. She'd made herself indispensable through a combination of genuine expertise and the steady accumulation of leverage. She knew where every conduit ran, which failsafe was real and which was theater, and how to make the whole system produce 30% less heat than the Vethka monitoring systems believed it was producing. The difference she fed into a secondary network that ran the unauthorized relay station, broadcasting human language signals to settlements across the breach. The Vethka had found the secondary network 11 days ago. They hadn't shut it down because shutting it down required physical access to the tap controls, which required going through Colm, which required a military operation that would damage the tap, which would make the city uninhabitable, which was not an outcome Vane could explain to the Conclave. Hence Kale. She's going to keep sending people, Kale said. She's going to keep losing them, Bren said. Until she doesn't. He turned his cup. They'd given him actual coffee, not reconstituted, which had not happened to him in approximately 4 years, between his palms. She doesn't need to win the fight. She just needs to get one person close enough to isolate the tap controls from you. After that, she can deal with Colm any way she wants. Bren was quiet. What I'm going to tell Vane, Kale said, is that you agreed to stand down the secondary relay and submit to Conclave reassignment. Bren's eyes went flat. What I'm actually going to do, he continued, is give you 48 hours to move whatever needs to be moved. The relay components, the technical knowledge in Bren's head, the secondary network codes, all of it out of Korath below before the Conclave receives any report at all. A long silence. And then what, Bren said. Then Vane gets her reassignment. She gets Colm presenting before the Conclave as a pacified asset. She gets to close her problem file. He paused. Colm goes with you, obviously, and you'll need a vehicle. You just said your wagon's in impound. I know where the impound yard is. Bren looked at him for a very long time. Then she looked at Colm. Some communication passed between them that Kale could not read. Why, she said. You could take the wagon and go. Vane doesn't care about the medical supplies. She cares about us. Kale thought about the whistle. 3 short notes. The small hands that had pressed it into his palm and said, "Come back." The relay broadcast reached the Reach settlements, he said. My daughter is in the Reach settlements. The woman with the mechanical arm was still at the bar when Kale came back to the tavern. He thought that was probably not a coincidence. He sat next to her. You're still here, she said. You knew about Bren, Kale said. The way you said run. You knew what Vane was setting me up for. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, my name is Sav. I've been in this city for 8 months. Before that, I was in the Reach for about 4 years. She turned to look at him directly. Her mechanical arm was a beautiful piece of work up close. Old pre-burning actuator design, but maintained with the kind of care that meant someone loved it. I know who you are. Not just Kaleth. The things that came after. Kale waited. There are about 40 of us in the city, she said. People who've been watching, waiting for something. Waiting for what? Honestly, she half smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been broken and healed crooked. We weren't sure, but something. She looked at her drink. Tell me the plan, he told her. She was quiet for a moment afterward. Then she said the impound yard is on level 2. There are 4 Vethka monitors on overnight rotation and 12 human contractors who are not going to stop anything if they think it's an authorized vehicle movement. I figured 12 human contractors, Kale said. The gate codes change at second bell. I figured second bell. She looked at him sideways. You figured a lot of things. I've been doing this a while. So have we. She finished her drink. I'll get the others. How much time do we have? He checked the chrono on his wrist. Scavenged, cracked face, still accurate within 90 seconds. 22 hours before I'm supposed to report to Vane. Sav nodded slowly, then she stood. Get some sleep, she said. The next part's going to be loud. The next part was in fact very loud. It began quietly. That was the thing about the best planned catastrophes. They always began quietly. A set of gate codes entered at second bell, slightly ahead of rotation. A vehicle manifest that Bren had forged with 3 hours' work, and a printer that legally didn't exist. Kale walked into the impound yard in a level 2 maintenance uniform that Sav's people had sourced in the time it took him to sleep 4 hours and eat a meal. and he walked out driving his wagon. Colm was in the back, he barely fit. Kale drove. They went to the thermal tap. This was the part that required timing. Bren had spent the 40 hours since their meeting compressing every critical piece of her secondary network into a portable array no larger than a field pack. The relay codes, the broadcast keys, the topographical maps of signal paths that had been maintaining contact with 83 settlements across the breach for 6 years. 6 years of survival information. 6 years of knowing you weren't alone. She handed it to Kale without ceremony. "Don't drop it," she said. "I won't drop it. If you drop it, I won't drop it." She looked at him for a moment with the sharp eyes of someone making a final assessment. Then she said, "There was a boy in Calith. During the uprising, he got a group of 60 people out through the service tunnels, while the Vethka were running their suppression sweep. The stories say he went back in after." Kale didn't say anything. "Were you that man?" "I couldn't leave them," he said. Which was true, and was also not quite an answer, and which seemed to satisfy her. They left the tap at a walk. The thing about walking in Korath below was that, if you walked like you had somewhere to be, you got somewhere. The Vethka social architecture, like all Vethka architecture, was premised on the idea that humans had been reduced to a predictable calculus of need and survival, that they could be managed like a resource, because they would always choose the rational thing. And the rational thing had been so carefully constrained that it always pointed in the direction the Vethka needed it to point. What they had not accounted for, and what they kept not accounting for, was the thing that lived just past rational. The thing that made a man go back into a burning city. The thing that made a woman with a mechanical arm spend 8 months in a city she hated, waiting for something she couldn't fully define. The thing that made 63 years of accumulated human stubbornness look at a perfectly maintained trap and find the one seam where the welding hadn't taken. The trouble started at the level 2 checkpoint. It started because one of the human contractors, a young man who had, until approximately 30 seconds ago, been reliably predictable in his calculation of personal risk, looked at the wagon and recognized Colm. "That's the Mech's enforcer," he said, not loudly, just to the guard beside him. The guard was Vethka. In the 11 seconds that followed, several things happened in rapid sequence. The Vethka guard reached for his communicator. Colm, who had excellent hearing, and the reaction speed of someone who had spent 20 years converting himself into a weapon, moved. Kale floored the accelerator. They went through the checkpoint without stopping. The Vethka alarm system in Korath below was good. It was designed for exactly this kind of event. A breach of a secured level, a vehicle moving against traffic flow, a garrison alert that could have the exits sealed in under 4 minutes. Kale knew the system was good because Bren had been kind enough to give him a full schematic of it during their 48 hours of preparation. He drove by the schematic in his head, left at the thermal vent junction because the right turn fed into the garrison staging area, down the service grade to level 3 because level 3's southern exit connected to the emergency ventilation tunnels that the Vethka had never bothered to monitor because they connected to nothing, except connected to the old mining shafts. And the old mining shafts connected to the breach. Sav was at level 3 with a vehicle of her own and 7 people in it. She fell in behind him without a word exchanged. Kale checked his mirror. Behind Sav's vehicle, a third had appeared. 2 of her 40 who'd apparently decided on their own that tonight was the night. Behind them, the level 3 corridor was beginning to fill with garrison vehicles. Vethk response teams moving with the efficient, non-frantic speed of a culture that did not panic because they had not yet learned to, because they had not yet had anything to panic about. He hoped tonight would be educational for them. The ventilation tunnel was tight. The wagon scraped both walls simultaneously for approximately 40 meters, and Kale drove it through on reflex and vid language, and the specific focus of a man who has decided that the thing behind him is worse than the thing ahead of him. The scraping stopped. The tunnel opened into the mining shaft, and the mining shaft was dark and smelled of 10,000-year-old rock, and the vaguest ghost of human sweat from the workers who'd moved through it before the world ended. He turned on the headlights. Behind him, Sav's vehicle emerged from the tunnel. Behind Sav the other 2, and behind them, nothing. The tunnel had not been wide enough for a Vethka garrison vehicle. He could hear, distantly, the sound of the alarmful system escalating. Bren said quietly from the seat beside him. "That worked. Don't congratulate it yet," Kale said. "I'm not congratulating it. I'm noting it. The mining shaft ran for 6 kilometers. Kale drove it at the speed of a man who wants to be somewhere else, while also maintaining the structural integrity of the passage he's moving through, which was a specific kind of speed that he'd gotten good at. The convoy followed. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were engines and rock, and the distant diminishing wail of an alarm that was somebody else's problem now. They emerged into the breach at zero dark, under a sky that still had the old burning's taint to it. The iron rust wash at the horizon that 11 years of atmospheric recovery hadn't fully cleaned. The desert stretched away in all directions. Cold now at night. It was always cold in the breach at night. Cale stopped the wagon and got out. He stood for a moment listening to the convoy settle behind him. Sav's vehicle pulled up alongside. The 7 people in it looked out at him with expressions he'd gotten familiar with over years. The particular mixture of fear and something else. Something that didn't have a clean word for it, but that he recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard since childhood. "The relay array," he said to Bren. "Can you broadcast from here?" She was already pulling it out of her pack. "Give me 8 minutes." He gave her 8 minutes. He stood in the cold of the breach, and he looked back at the lights of Korath below on the horizon. The faint orange glow of it, the dim sense of all that complicated trapped life still going on inside its walls. And he thought about Vane, who would be standing in a very clean room, receiving reports that her carefully constructed solution had developed a very human complication. He took the whistle from around his neck, turned it in his fingers, small, silver, dented along one edge from the time he'd dropped it in Calath and had to dig through rubble to find it. 3 notes. "Come back." He'd been trying. "Ready," Bren said. He turned around. The broadcast went out on every channel that Bren's relay had ever used, and a few it hadn't. It was not a dramatic broadcast. It didn't need to be. It was a signal, a location, a set of codes that the 83 settles across the breach had been receiving for 6 years. And what it said, in the stripped-down vocabulary of people who had learned to communicate in minimum necessary words, was, "Still here. Still running, not stopped." Cale watched Bren work, the old woman's hands moving over the array. With the confident economy of someone who had made this motion so many times it had become the same thing as breathing. Colm sat on the wagon's running board and said nothing. Sav stood beside Cale. "Where will you go?" she said. "The Reach. The medical supplies are still in impound." "I know." He looked at the array, the soft pulse of its transmission indicator. "Vane's problem file is officially open again. She's going to be busy for a while managing the political consequences of losing the thermal tap operator. She doesn't have the garrison bandwidth to run down one wagon in the breach." Sav thought about that. Probably true. Probably true is good enough for me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's in the Reach specifically?" "My daughter." A short silence. "How old?" He paused. 12 now, maybe. I've been moving a lot." Sav looked out at the dark horizon. The rust sky was beginning to fade at its edges. The first suggestion of gray that meant the desert's short night was running out. "We could use someone," she said. "Who thinks the way you think? For what comes next?" What comes next? She didn't answer right away. She stood with her mechanical arm at her side, its actuator joints slightly lit by the glow of the relay array, and she looked like someone who had been carrying a thought for a long time, and was finally setting it down somewhere solid. "The relay network," she said. "It reaches 83 settlements. That's not nothing, that's people. Organized people who've been receiving coordinated information for 6 years. Who've been hearing, underneath the survival data, the shape of something." She paused. "Vane's going to want to shut it down now. Move against the settlements. She can't let the network keep running." "No," Cale agreed. "She can't, which means the settlements need to be ready." He looked at her. "That's a big thing. It's been building for a long time." He turned the whistle in his fingers. "Come back." He'd been trying. He'd been trying since Calath, since the girl had pressed the whistle into his hands. And he'd made a promise he kept not quite being able to keep, kept falling short of by the length of whatever emergency was currently happening. The medical supplies were in impound. The impound was in Korath below. Korath below was going to be in administrative chaos for the next 72 hours at minimum. "The Reach first," he said. "And then we'll see." Sav looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Bren said from behind them, "Broadcast out. It'll repeat on a 6-hour cycle until someone physically destroys the array, which will require them to find the array, which they won't." She closed the pack. "Also, I've locked the thermal tap at full output. It'll run that way for about 3 days before the failsafes catch it. The Vethka are going to have a very warm few days." Cale looked at her. She shrugged. "I was thorough." He stood in the desert, in the dark and cold and old iron smell of the world, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, because hope had gotten expensive over the years and he'd learned to budget it carefully. Something smaller and more durable than hope. The specific feeling of a gear that has been grinding against nothing finally finding purchase. He got back in the wagon. The convoy moved out across the breach in the last dark before dawn. 4 vehicles, 14 people, a portable relay array broadcasting on 30 frequencies, and a locked thermal tap generating enough excess heat to make the Vethka Conclave's morning meeting significantly more uncomfortable than they'd planned. The desert spread ahead of them, vast and iron, and scoured clean by a decade of hard weather, marked only by the old trails that people had worn into it by the simple act of surviving. Cale drove. The whistle hung warm against his sternum. 3 short notes, come back. He was on his way. Vane received the full report at dawn. She stood in her clean room and read it through twice. The secondary cycling in the slow, deliberate pattern of someone processing information that did not fit their model. The thermal tap, the impound breach, the convoy, the relay broadcast. And one other thing. A secondary report from the garrison checkpoint that she read 3 times before she accepted it, because it was the kind of thing that the models kept failing to predict and kept requiring adjustment for. In the 8 months that her records showed a woman named Sav occupying a barstool in a tavern built into a coolant reservoir, she'd been meeting quietly and at careful intervals with 39 other individuals in Korath below. Not coordinating anything obvious, not moving anything physical, just meeting, talking. The garrison monitoring systems had flagged none of it because it looked exactly like what it was. People talking. And the monitoring systems were designed to weapons, contraband, tactical movement, not conversation. The problem, Vane was discovering, was that humans were capable of a specific kind of long preparation that didn't show up in tactical monitoring. They could spend years not doing something, in a way that was in fact doing something. They could carry a plan the way they carried old grief. Folded up small, tucked away, brought out, and added to and put away again, until one morning it was no longer a plan but an event. She had known about Calith. She had read the files. She had not, she now understood, fully read the files. She stood in her clean room and looked at the desert on her monitor, the breach, vast and rust-red, and crossed in the early light by 4 sets of tire tracks heading east. And she felt, for the first time in her career as an executor, a sensation she had to look up in the translated emotional lexicon her training had given her. The word was unease. The word was also insufficient. She closed the report. She opened a new one. She began composing the documentation that the conclave would require. The incident summary, the threat assessment, the recommended response protocols. In the recommended response section, she hesitated for a long time. The thermal tap was running hot. The relay was broadcasting. The network was active. The people were moving. She thought about the Caleth files, the boy who'd gone back in. She typed, response complexity exceeds current modeling parameters. Recommend expanded assessment before deployment of standard protocols. It was the most honest thing she'd written in years. Outside the clean room in the city below, Korath below went about its morning. The trading, the arguing, the slow commerce of survival. The human contractors arrived at their stations. The tavern opened early. Someone in sublevel 4, entering the thermal tap chamber to assess the situation, found it empty and running hot and broadcasting on 30 frequencies, and stood for a long time in the smell of sulfur and machine oil, trying to understand what they were looking at. And in the breach, in the growing light, the convoy moved east. Cale drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand around the whistle. The desert went on a long way, it always did. But there was road under the wheels and a direction. And, somewhere ahead, a girl with her mother's eyes who had been waiting, a very patient, 12 years of hard growing up kind of wait. He'd been trying. Today felt different. Today felt like finally.